Hello there, and welcome to this, the Savage Balance Podcast. Hey, how you doing? Welcome to this, episode number 15 of the Savage Balance Podcast. This is the second part of a two-parter, talking about Football Manager and addiction. There's less Football Manager in this, but there's a lot more addiction talk, so there's some good stuff in this, I promise you. If you haven't listened to the first part, I massively recommend you do that first, and then get onto the second bit. It's pretty cool in that way. Yeah, I did it linearly. I thought I'd do the first part first and the second part second, because otherwise it would get confusing, wouldn't it? Anyway, I don't want to waffle too much because there's plenty of that coming. So I just thought I'd briefly say a little thing to say that. And enjoy this part 2 of Football Manager and addiction. Hey, just thought I would briefly interrupt. I'm sure you can hear the sound of my pooch munching some biscuits behind me. I just wanted to say briefly that just because this is my personal relationship with it doesn't mean it has to be yours. You know, if you find value in using something like that and you use it in the same way as me, then, you know, that's great. I don't want to encourage any unnecessary guilt. You know, this is a game that rewards continuous dedicated use. And that's where the pleasure is found. So I do think it's healthy to analyze all our relationships to whatever we're doing. But if yours feels fine and gives you pleasure and meaning and doesn't carry those negative consequences, then it's all good. I just wanted to mention that just because I don't think I mentioned it in the episode. But anyway, on with the podcast. Hey there, everyone. How you doing? I hope you're all well. I hope you're good. For you, it's been a week. For me, it's been a wee. It was very nice. It was very revealing. It was very satisfying. And then I went down to check on my partner because she was yelling. And she's on the PlayStation 2 at the moment, and she's struggling to jump over a book as a rat in a suit. So, you know, we've all got our problems, haven't we? We've all got our difficulties, but I can't jump. That was it. As far as I know, that problem might still be there when I finish this podcast. I don't know. There's not much I can do to help at the moment, but I wish them all the best because they're very important to me. And I want them to be a little rat in a suit that can jump over a series of books. That's what I want. So, yeah. I mentioned in the last episode that this could be a two-parter. And it is. That's what it is. We've got there. It's a two-parter. I went for 45 minutes. I didn't keep it concise, so I probably won't keep this concise either. If you're just listening to this as the first one, go back and listen to the previous one, because that really was the primer for all of this. We talked through, a definition of addictions, different types of addictions that exist, the things that I've struggled with personally, how to recognize addictions and the cycles that you can go into. So those sorts of things. In fact, just to recap one thing, because I think it's important, I will briefly just now run through that definition of addiction, which I really like, which is any behavior, substance or not, that a person craves, finds pleasure in and relief in, despite experiencing the negative consequences, and cannot give up despite those negative consequences. That is a good groundwork to recognize addictions, and certainly experience that with Football Manager, that is for sure. I mentioned last time as well that I will briefly tell you a bit about the other game that I got addicted with, to do with stats and figures, and it rivals the bagging game in terms of full-on addiction to it. But it just took over me lockdown a bit, and what it was is that while we were in lockdown, obviously we couldn't. Sorry for the little flicking there. I thought I could be subtle. I forgot to put my timer on to say how long I'd started, and I needed to check how long I've recorded for. Anyway, at the beginning of lockdown, obviously we couldn't go out, so we were inside, and we were inside a lot with our pooch, and it was moving into summer, so it wasn't quite hot enough, and we wanted to keep her occupied. And she has her own addiction problems actually with balls. She is addicted to balls enough that we don't take them out anymore with her because she is a bit. She gets very defensive over them. She can't put them down. She makes, when we've tried to take them away from her, she's made, aggressive growling sounds. So we don't have them outside the house with her anymore. But we thought in the back garden that would be fine. And at that time, no one was living next to us, so there wasn't really any danger. So we thought we'll do that. And because you just accumulate things through time, and because balls have been bought for us, and you find balls and all this sort of stuff, I found out that we had a good number of balls. In fact, we had about 32 balls. And in my head, 32 is a bit of a magical number because that is a number. Oh, sorry. A little kind of, don't know what that was. It was kind of a burp / fainting sound. Anyway, because we had 32, that's a magical number in my head because I recognize that as a number that you can keep dividing down and playing to 1 against 1 until you get down to 1. Because 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1. So you can have a tournament. So I thought, why don't we pick balls at random and we'll throw them both together, and whichever one she grabs, that ball goes through and the other one goes out. Nice bit of fun with me and my partner. Our pooch loved it. We had a great time doing it. And you start to notice patterns of, she prefers yellow balls to the orange balls, and the Pets at Home ones to the hollow ones, and that multicolored one isn't doing as well, but actually did well there for some reason. And you just started picking things up like that. And so again, the addictive part of my brain, the craving part, first of all starts to crave doing it again, craving the stats, craving being involved in it, and then finds the pleasure in doing it and being in it and treating it like a proper league or a proper cup. And then finds a lot of relief in it. And you'll say, well, there's no negative consequences. Well, there was, because I got more and more into it. I started to take over. I started to run through all the stats with my partner. I started to really sour the game for them to the point where they stopped playing because I just wasn't. And I thought, maybe I can do one fun games and then maybe do a league myself. It basically ended up to a point where there was a whole league that we did. Ended up finding extra balls in places, and I still have the PDFs that I made on my laptop. Yep, that's right, PDFs for the daily leagues that I would play, in which I rated the balls, I ranked the balls, I put them in first, second, third and fourth league, plus the leftover balls. There was enough to sort of have a kind of mini tournament to see who would get promoted. The top 2 would get promoted, the bottom 2 would get relegated. And I just played this, and if you won, you'd get a point, and and it would all depend on how many won in a row. So if 2 teams finished the season on 5, one would get, if someone had won 3 in a row and the other had won 1 in a row, then the 3 in a row would get through. Basically, I know I'm boring people with boring statistics. What I'm trying to give a good example of how I just became heavily addicted to these things, and that addiction would play out. And again, the negative consequences. Sometimes, I never put her in danger, my pooch, and in fact, we'd stop the game halfway through if she was getting too much as we're moving into summer. But at points, that I could see the inner dialogue in my head going, I think she can get through the next round, and then we can stop there. Despite going, she's tired, maybe I'll just stop. that impulse was there to be like, I need to finish this, I need to finish the league, I need to finish the game, otherwise if I finish with not enough left, I won't know who's won, and I have to wait until tomorrow, but I'm busy tomorrow, so it's 2 days. Like, this was a frustration that would play out in my life, and this is why Football Manager is an addictive game for me. But anyway, let's get on to a more substantial version of what this is all about. And I want to talk a little bit about what makes someone susceptible to addiction. There's many different aspects that come into play. And Gabor Mate, who is the Dr. Gabor Mate, addiction specialist, who's written some fantastic books. And in fact, I didn't mention before, there'll be some show notes, as I mentioned before, but there'll be some conversations he's had, definitely one with Rangan Chatterjee. Maybe he's done a good one with Rich Roll. He's also done a good few he's done one with Russell Brand. He's done a couple with Rich Roll and Rangan Chatterjee. He's talked to so many people. There's so many podcasts out there with him talking, so there's plenty of Gabor Mate to get. Anyway, he has said that there are kind of three factors that make someone susceptible to addiction. The first one being psychological. So again, some level of psychological pain or distress being present, some kind of trauma potentially being there, a disturbance of a sense of self, this kind of feeling in you that you're not quite good enough. These are all sort of aspects of the psychological point of view that can make you more susceptible to addiction. The second one is psychological. Hang on, I've my loads. I've written psychological as one, and second is psychological. The second one is physiological, and I either spelled it wrong or it got spell checked. Yeah. So the first one, psychological aspects. So I guess internal. The second, physiological, the sort of literal brain circuitry that we have. The fact that when you engage in that sort of pattern, when you click a like on or a button on the social medias, or you press the buy button on Amazon, or you spend that money, or you enact that addictive behavior over and again, a bit of dopamine is released, a small shot of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. So again, it makes this, I guess there's a hormonal response, and then you get that hormonal reliance to that response. There's a definite biochemical susceptibility happening at the same time. And just briefly before I get to the third one, our dialogue around addiction has tended to paint the physiological one as the most, and in some cases only, fundamental. That if it's an addictive substance like heroin, like alcohol, people will get addicted. Heroin being the big one. The idea of, in fact, I've got this little thing that I've said from Johann Hari, who's written a couple of great books. One called Chasing the Scream, about drug policies and the sort of social aspects of drugs. And then the very, very hugely successful. Oh, what was it called? It's gone now. It's certainly one of the best books I've ever read. One of those books where I bought a couple of copies and lent them to people because it's that good. Lost Connections, that's what it's called. About the real root causes he describes of anxiety and depression, them sort of being social, and it's just a really phenomenal book. Anyway, there's a TED talk that there is a link to from this, and he says in that our dialogue is around that. This sort of idea that it's purely chemical, that, if you lock someone in a room and you give them heroin 3 times a day, they'll come out of it a week later craving that heroin because that chemical is gone within them and is pumping around their bodies. And the example he gives about that is, say, if you know somebody, if you have a relative or something, and they fall and they have a broken hip, they'll go into hospital and they'll have some surgery done, and they'll be given diamorphine during that surgery. Well, in fact, diamorphine is heroin in the way that he describes it. He says it is heroin, and in fact, it's probably a purer form of heroin than what you might be getting as a street dealer might be giving you and such, because you don't know what it's cut with or what it's laced with or what else is in it. Whereas diamorphine is a more pure version of that. And it's a pain management thing, and it's medically pure to deal with that pain during that time, and they'll be given that pain management through that time, and yet you'll be given it regularly. And yet, if you come out of hospital, or if that person comes out of hospital having experienced that broken hip and it's healed, there's very few, although it does obviously happen, does exist, there's very few cases of addiction to that prescription medication, to that diamorphine. And yet it's potentially a purer form of a thing that we imagine that if we inject it into somebody enough, they will naturally get addicted to it. So it does have its essential part to play, obviously, the biochemical side of it, the physiological parts and the brain circuitry and the dopamine and the hormones. These are all very essential parts of the puzzle. But I would argue that they are only one component in a story in which there are multiple things that start that off. So I think that's interesting to think. It's not simply biochemical. Obviously, there's the psychological, there's the physiological. And the third one, which I mentioned actually in the last podcast, and I mentioned here that this is where I want to do a separate word on, he said about the spiritual side. And obviously spirituality is a difficult word, and a lot of people equate it to religion, and some people equate it less to religion, and it can have a lot in common with atheistic things. Anyway, I think the basic idea of what he means by spiritual is a kind of emotional version, different to psychological, a sense of potential meaninglessness or being deficient, having a deficient kind of emptiness within you. It's similar to not feeling quite good enough, but has a sort of separate aspect to it. So I guess some people may attribute them as the same things, the spiritual and the psychological, but Gabor Mate puts them in two different sections. So he says psychological, physiological, and spiritual. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I've done research and read a lot of Johann Hari stuff. Well, from his thing, I would potentially add a fourth. Of course, I'm not an addiction expert, so I don't want to challenge Gabor Mate's beautiful, phenomenal work. That would be silly of me. But what I don't see in that list with physiological, psychological, and spiritual is I don't see a place for the fourth one I would add, which is social. That the environment we're in has a huge part to play. Addiction can be categorized as a social problem, especially as we are in, I would argue, a highly traumatized society. And when we are born, we have to really adapt to our environment. And if our environment is a highly traumatized society that is sort of out of balance, I would argue, with our natural instincts in terms of, the amount of work we do and the environments we do it in, the lighting that's available, the seats that are available, our limited access to, I was going to say exercise, but movement. And beyond that, I mean play. That play is outsourced again to potentially a thing where we sit down and play on consoles, which again can have a good, useful, positive aspect. But if it becomes an addictive personality trait, I think that's the right way of phrasing it, personality trait. Anyway, if it becomes that addictive cycle, then then it becomes problematic in that way. But we're a highly traumatized society, I would argue, that is sort of, stimulating us to be consumers above and beyond anything else. Primarily, in my head, the biggest example of that is the fact that Black Friday still happened and occurred in a lockdown, that we still needed to, and we were encouraged a lot to spend and go and spend money for Christmas. And then obviously that spending and that mixing and mingling, and in Kent, in Dartford, in fact, where I grew up and raised, we were not too far from Bluewater Shopping Centre, which I think at the time was, when it was built 20 odd years ago, was the biggest in Europe shopping centre. Anyway, that was open, I think, during the last lockdown. It was certainly open during December at a time of a global pandemic, that we've been treated as consumers, that our ability to buy stuff is first and foremost. And to be a consumer, arguably, you could argue that you have to feel inadequate in some way, that you feel like you need these things in your life to help complete you. The idea of what you don't just simply buy the version of soap that you buy, for example, because you think it smells nice and it keeps me clean. Potentially the advertising you're being told as to, I say you're, I'm including me as well. This is not a, yes, you have done this. It's an us. When we are advertised at, we're not being told the soap will make you hygienic and smell nice. You're being told that your life will be more valuable, that you'll be a better person, you'll be a better human being if you buy this particular brand of soap. So we live in this highly traumatized society that treats us as consumers, in which we have to do more work, and we get, in general, less money, and rising prices in houses, in food, in just general living in big cities. Social media can often be a simulation of real connection, although again, it has a meaningful place in our lives. But again, a lot of these things, a lot of our worth is measured, social, economical. Basically, I think this is my vague argument for saying that we are a highly traumatized society. And if you are being born into that trauma and you inherit that part of those traumas, then the society you're in is creating the tendency for you to be addicted. That there is, because we have a natural innate need to bond. There is a natural innate need for human beings to bond, and if we're in a society that also limits that bonding, let more and more people. Again, I think it's something I saw in that TED talk from Johann Hari, saying that simultaneously we're having less and less close friends, and yet more and more floor space, and he said that's a good metaphor for what we're doing. We're evaluating things over people and over connection. And so we're getting less and less bonds, less and less human bonds. And he says that you need to bond to something that will give you relief. And if you're not finding that bond in relationships and in people, potentially you'll find it in this other external source that will be problematic, an addiction that will have some kind of negative consequence for you. Again, I'm mainly going off of this TED Talk in this section because that's what his work is. The reason I would put social in. It's really changed my perception on not just addiction but on anxiety and depression too. But he talks about a professor, Professor Alexander, that he spoke to, who sort of reimagined the way this famous rat in a cage experiment, where you took a rat, you put them in a cage, and you give them access to 2 bottles of water, one a regular bottle of water, one laced with heroin and cocaine. And people found that essentially nearly 100% of those rats will overdose in that environment, basically saying there's a biochemical need, there's a biochemical urge that if that is available, we should. And that, I guess, informs things like policy, like global policy, but national policy as well about drugs. Remove the drugs from the place, make them illegal, then people won't have them. But Professor Alexander came along and he looked at this experiment and he thought, well, hang on, rats tend to be very social creatures. They have a lot. And at the moment, that's a single rat and it's in a cage. So what he did was basically built a great big rat park, which he called Rat Heaven. So it had all different varieties of food. It had loads of coloured balls. It had a massive network of tunnels. And key and most important, it had loads of other rats. There were loads of other rats. There was loads of sex that they could have. They were bloody loving the sex. They were shagging away like it was no one's business. And again, they left them the 2 bottles of water, one cocaine laced, one heroin laced. And they found that the rats that were in isolation, nearly 100% of them would die of overdose. And in this rat park, in this rat heaven, it was nearly zero. It was close to zero. It was close to nothing. Such a huge turnaround. And then Johann Hari in that other thing goes on to talk about how it relates to humans, and so it's not just specifically in rats. But I think that's such a massively key, wonderful, glaring example about how addiction isn't necessarily like reaching for a substance. It's a lack of connection. It's a lack of connection to the people around you, and a lack of connection to your society and to your culture potentially, and to your neighborhood and to your friends and to your family and to whoever you value as a human being or as an animal as well, connections with pets and such like that. So a lot of, again, talking about this highly traumatized society, and why I think social is an important one to put in, is that as children, we enter into this highly traumatized society and we're not given the tools to have this kind of present calm that we need, this kind of this moment to pause and to take stock of our emotions and our feelings and to really process them in a helpful and useful way. This is actually one reason why, little plug for another episode, I did an episode on morality in kids' films, and I think Inside Out is such a key. It's one of my favorite ever films, and that's the reason why, is because, that teaches kids, I think, to have a good relationship with their emotions, what they need and what they mean, and the complexity of them not in an educational teaching way, but in a fun, entertaining, beautiful way. But we're not taught these things as kids, and so we don't have a place to put our emotions, and so it gets outsourced a lot of the time to addictive things. And addiction, people say addiction is a social problem. It reminds me of how I heard Ed Stafford talking on Russell Brand's Under the Skin podcast, and he was talking about homelessness, and he was saying homelessness isn't necessarily just a housing problem, because there are plenty of houses, there are plenty of vacant places all over, and plus there's a lot of building going on. He found with his time, he did a TV program where he lived homeless for a while. He said it's more of a social problem because of the lack of support networks, and he found there was actually a high amount of ex-military. I'd really recommend that listen. It was really interesting. Anyway, I just thought there were parallels between saying homelessness is a social problem, I think also addiction is a social problem, and that's why I would categorize it as one of the 4 things that make someone susceptible to addiction. So Gabor Mate's 3 is psychological, physiological, and spiritual. But I would add the 4th, which is really Johann Hari's 4th, which is social as well. And I guess, so those things make us susceptible to these things. But there's also a big role in which, again, Gabor Mate's work, he talks highly of trauma. He says, and I will say, but again, little sip of the old water just to moisten the lips. Oh, lovely moist lips. Oh, wow, lovely moist lips. He says with trauma, he says, not everyone who has been traumatized becomes addicted, but everyone who is addicted has been traumatized at some point. And I think trauma can be categorized in many different ways. He mainly talks about childhood trauma and the way that that impacts us. And I think childhood trauma is, again, I'm not an expert. I'm certainly not an expert on trauma at all. I'm not an expert on any of this. This is just stuff I'm picking up and learning, and I'm interested and fascinated in, not just my relationship with it, but in fact, slight tangent, I think one of the reasons why addiction is such a key thing in my head and why it's such an important topic for me is that really it's the reason my dad died a bit over 9 years ago. His was alcohol addiction and addiction to drugs. And I feel like that's one reason that's woke me up to my own feelings of my own, even like I say, the alcohol and the caffeine before, even potentially the smoking, although smoking obviously is bad, but there's ways in which you can, especially with alcohol and caffeine, you can have very healthy relationships with them all. And I think I discovered these things at a time when I was still processing a lot to do with my dad's death. I think I still am, to be honest, a lot, over 9 years on. I got very upset about it a few days ago, as if it had just happened a couple of months ago. So I think it's a scar that will always be there. But I do think this is one of the things, it's massively affected the trajectory of my life and my interests, but it's also, I think, spurned a big interest, obviously, probably for a lot of people, it's obviously, now that I'm mentioning it, is it's spurred my interest in addiction. And I feel like it's some kind of move on my part to save him in some way, to save him from that fate, even though obviously the logical brain knows that is not a possibility anymore. I think there's still a bit of part of me that doesn't know it or refuses to accept that is still the possibility, that is still the truth of the matter. Because, once you accept the truth of that matter, then you have to deal with the consequences of what that means. And maybe that's the bit that I'm not ready for. Anyway, that's a slight tangent, wasn't it? I guess talking about trauma, I guess that is a traumatic thing. I don't think it is a very traumatic part of my life, for sure. And a wound that I think will always be there. But anyway, so I'm not an expert, but I think I've become very interested in it in lots of different ways, and that one being the primary big red hooting horn that says why that is. But so trauma can be characterized in many different ways. I don't think in childhood trauma, it's not simply just big events that we might think about, a big, we just mentioned it there, death or, grief or divorce and separation or a sudden tragedy out of nowhere. Like these things are big events, and obviously they would be big traumatic things. But I think we can broaden the definition of trauma out to perceptively small moments in which children who haven't had the critical capacities for critical thinking installed in them, they're not developed enough to really criticize a thought that's going on in their head. It means that any kind of, I've said small, but I mean small in like inverted commas, because they're not small, they're massive, they're huge moments. I've got lots of memories that you would arguably say they're very small little things that don't mean anything, but actually they mean a lot to me, and they meant a lot to my development, and they helped lay a part of my foundation down at a time when I couldn't process it in any other way, and helped sort of create my coping mechanisms on top of that, which maybe has led to me being addicted to Football Manager in certain ways. But so things like, not being able to get the love that you feel you deserve. You know, you go up and you've drawn a lovely, beautiful picture, and you go, "Oh, I'm parent," or "my, grandparent," or "legal guardian." You probably wouldn't go, "Oh, legal guardian." That sounds like if you're a 4-year-old and you're going, "Oh, legal guardian," I feel like there's certainly a level of trauma you might be experiencing. That feels a bit distant to me. What do I know? Nothing. You know some things, you've written them down. These are all other people's words. You've got distracted, haven't you? Well, I'm just trying to protect myself because I'm feeling a bit vulnerable, as if I might upset somebody. You probably haven't. What is this I'm doing? I don't know. Let's get back to what I was doing, shall I? Gabor Mate never does this. I'm listening to Gabor Mate, and he's saying in his voice, that not everyone who has been traumatized becomes addicted, but everyone addicted has become traumatized. Or have they? I don't know. Look at me. I'm pouring Guinness over my face. He never does that. He just keeps talking as if he knows what he's on about, because he does know what he's on about. That's what it is, isn't it? I don't know what I'm on about. Focus, please, for fuck's sakes. I'm listening to this about trauma and about Football Manager. I'm not interested in your fucking voice. Was a bit critical. God, I can't. I've gone somewhere else. Let's get back on track. Let's go look at my notes. Perceptively small moments is where I'm on. That example of that child holding up the picture and saying, "Look, parent, look, mummy, look, daddy, I've drawn this," and them not getting that validation back that they want, or getting criticised or getting angry because that parent might potentially, I don't know, have just had some bad news and they took it out on that child. Maybe that could be the trauma. Maybe that could be the feeling of, I'm not good enough for love. Ideas of feeling separate or not seen, or maybe, a pressure to perform. That's certainly something Rich Roll talks about a lot with his role in his life and with addiction, of never quite feeling good enough and always having high. Well, actually, he doesn't talk about that. Like, he was always rewarded and validated for his profession, through his performances and performing well. And that's an impulse he still has to this day, he says. But there's loads of things. There's loads of these things that you could say are arguably small moments, but they basically can be characterized by what feelings you're feeling. If you have a memory of something in particular, that might be a trauma that you're holding on to. So that's one way in childhood and stuff like that these moments happen in the childhood. A few other interesting ways to just briefly mention is things like in the womb. There's a growing evidence that the emotional states of the mothers and there's physical things that they go through have an impact on the developing physiology and psychology of the in utero fetus, which is fascinating, really. I guess it's the example of, like, a good example of this is sort of like if the mother is feeling a lot of excess stress, there will be a lot of cortisol going through the body and a lot of adrenaline. And of course, the child is within the body. So the fetus is getting those sort of things, and it's going to, maybe, for example, he mentioned, increase that child's adrenaline glands. They're going to be physically larger than a child who hasn't experienced, than an in utero fetus who hasn't experienced that level of in the womb stress from the mother, which is why I guess it's even more important and key to keep the mother safe. And I'm slowly lingering further and further away from, like, I think solid science, but certainly things worth mentioning that people have anecdotally referred to a difference in babies who have been born through a kind of hypnobirthing thing, that the actual idea that the birth itself is a trauma. I always think of it, and this is a bit of just a guess on my part. It feels like a bit of an educated guess, but I don't know. That the idea that you are safe within this kind of warm, deep orangey red environment. It's probably not. That's probably just how it's shown on the telly, innit? It's probably well dark in there, but you can't see anyway. Just a really warm, nurturing place that you are. And then suddenly that warm, nurturing place, everything around you just starts pushing you out and pushing you down into this place that you don't fit, this small gap that you don't fit, and then the tension that you're going through there, and then you come out and there's screaming and there's lights and there's sound and there's chaos. That potentially could be described as your first trauma that a lot of us go through who aren't, C-section or other ways in which you can go about being born. But that, in a way, I feel like could be a potential trauma. There's even, things that people can talk about in terms of not preconception, but things that happen before you're even conceived, like the idea of inherited trauma, that trauma can be held through the generations, especially. I've posted a link actually in the show notes to Blind Boy talking about this with Russell Brand, inherited trauma, and about how he feels like a lot of his anxiety comes from, I think, his grandmother, or maybe his great grandmother, I can't remember, but being alive basically during the Great Famine in Ireland. Wasn't that great, to be honest. Pretty shitty, I think. Over half your population starving and dying at the hands of England, British England, woo! Inherited trauma from that sense, that the way it gets passed down, the relationships with food gets passed down subconsciously, and then that gets inherited into the... I'm not sure how much it has to do with genetics or not, but anyway, there's a link to that if you're interested in that. All these different ways in which we can just have trauma in our lives. It's really interesting. And if that trauma doesn't get seen to, it can really have a big impact on our lives. So I've talked a lot about different things, a bit about trauma, a bit about how we're susceptible to addiction, or one way of recognizing it through that cycle of addiction, different types and definitions and so forth. But I think to finish this off, to wrap this up, it's probably worth talking about potential solutions, potential ways, if you're feeling these feelings, if you think, all right, I'm a bit prepared now, I've heard a lot of what you've had to say, and I feel like maybe I'm recognizing some of these things within me. What do I do with it? Where do I go with it? How do I stop it? Because it's my coping mechanism. As I mentioned in the previous podcast, Rich Roll says that alcohol for him was never the problem. It was the solution to the problem. Obviously, that solution to the problem came with its own problems itself, and it was also a way of running away from the initial problem. But, what ways can people come out of it? I guess this is where most of all I feel out of my depth, because I can talk about those things and I'm interested in it, but there's so many different ways, and it's actually such a fragile subject that I will just straight away put my hands up and say, I don't know, I'm just interested in this. I'm not the best person to ask. But there are a few things that I've heard that I think would really help out. I imagine that any relationship with a addictive substance, an external substance, you'll either have to practice some kind of abstinence or create a framework around its usage. And I guess the framework would be, for examples of things, of necessary behaviors that are needed for survival, like really essential things like eating and things like sex, these natural impulses that we have, that to have a framework in which you can feel the true joy of those, in which, arguably, not arguably, in fact, but alcohol, that's probably something you can practice abstinence from, and you can still have a great quality of life without it. But whereas food, it's necessary, it's needed. So you need to find a framework for that usage. So there's those things, and there's many, many, many different routes. A few of the ones that I found interesting and I've thought about with the things that I've found difficult is one of them, and I'll just say before I get into it that I know that a lot of people find it problematic, and I get a lot of the criticisms that come with it. I also know that a lot of people find it wonderful, and so it's not worth throwing out. And a lot of people find it too religious, and that's why I really like Russell Brand's work on this, because it takes the specific religion out of it, although it's open to those interpretations if you still want them. But it's 12 steps, really, and I'm not an expert on them all, but I do feel like the first 3 steps in particular are really good at getting into the right headspace and the right framework to tackle any kind of addiction. And I'll break them down a little bit for you now. The first one is officially written: we admitted we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives have become unmanageable. And I guess what this says to me is some kind of acceptance, accepting that there is something there, accepting that there's a problem there. This is the first step towards anything: awareness and acceptance. You can't challenge something that you don't know isn't there. So I would say, I have all those other ones, but I would say, like, the first step for me, say with pornography, for example, was going, I accept that I am powerless over the pornography, that my life has become unmanageable when I am using it. And with Football Manager, I admit that I am powerless over Football Manager. When I am in an environment with it, its pull is too strong, and that my life can become unmanageable while using it in my life. So that's step one. Step two, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Russell Brand obviously has his alternative things, and Russell Brand's second thing, the way of interpreting that into a different language is, could you not be fucked? Essentially, what I understand and interpret this as is hope. So you have awareness and acceptance, and then the next stage is hope. Is there an alternative future out there for you? And the answer is always yes. There are multiple examples of whatever you are experiencing that you can access that will prove to you that no matter what you are going through, there are countless ways in which you can overcome those things and live with those things in a way that they don't direct your life in that problematic way. So the second one really is hope. And is there an alternative future out there for you? And the answer is yes. And you can find those people, and and they can give you hope. They can give you hope that power is within you too. And the third one, make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Obviously, the word God will be difficult for a lot of people, probably me included in that sense. Russell Brand again reframes that as, are you on your own going to unfuck yourself? Again, the idea of turning your life over to the care of God as we understood him, it's the as we understood him that's very important. It basically is saying, will you require help to get through this? Will you not rely on your own coping mechanisms because your own coping mechanisms have got you to this point? Will you ask for help? Will you find help somewhere else? And there is always help. There is always help. There are groups, there are people, there are individuals who understand your experience and want to help you and want to be there for you. So if you want that help, it is there for you. That is an absolute guarantee and a promise. So again, that's why I think the first three steps are very good. Then it gets into inventorying and taking responsibility and lots of other useful things which are massively important. But the first three steps are very key things that you can do right now in your head. So one is about acceptance, accepting you have a problem. Also awareness of the problem and accepting you have that problem. Two is about hope. Is there an alternative future out there for you? And that answer is yes, it is. And you can find those examples. And three, are you willing to ask for help and to be helped? Because that help is out there and that help wants to be there for you. So there's those. That's the 12-step things that I find really useful. What's difficult is I have some notes. All these notes are on my laptop, but I have some notes written on paper. And what I need to do is very briefly disconnect myself and go wander to find it. So I'll try to keep talking while I'm standing up and see if I can find it. But I can't seem to find it right now. Here we go. I've got it. Anything to stop me from editing. I can't bear the idea of editing. That would be horrible. It wouldn't. I can't be fucked to edit. Anyway, so there's the 12 steps. Another thing that's very useful is Gabor Mate has some questions, which I think are really useful. These are questions that these are not only applicable if you're struggling with mental health issues, with addiction issues, but also if you know someone who has addiction issues. And they're just two questions, and they're just an opening and a starter to get interested in these things. But the first question he says is, what does it do for you? So what is it for? What is the addiction for? What did addiction do for you? And the great thing about this is it's a way of and you can ask it of yourself or you can ask it physically to somebody else. The great thing about this question is it's a way of compassionately inquiring. It's not judging a person's behavior or a person themselves. It's validating their quest for that connection that we've talked about before. It's validating their connection to looking for something deeper and more meaningful. So if you're asking, what does the addiction do for you? What does it do? And in the short term as well, not the long-term negatives. I'm talking about the short-term pleasurable craving and the relief. Describe what it does to you. So if I'm to think about Football Manager in this way, what does Football Manager do for me? Well, for one thing, it gives me a kind of spark, a spark of life. I feel more awake, and there's like there's that rush of dopamine and adrenaline, and maybe the life I'm living doesn't give me room for that at the moment, or the life I was, especially as a teenager. I was very numb a lot of the time. I was not good at expressing my emotions at all. Didn't have that capability and that function. So maybe Football Manager gave me a way to experience full-on feelings in a safe way that didn't become unbearable, or was in a manageable and in a fictionalized scenario that I could enjoy. I could enjoy the downs and I could enjoy the highs in a safe environment that didn't mean I was susceptible to the outside world. That's one thing it could have potentially given me. And the second question he asks after that is, what happened in your life that made you not be able to touch those qualities without that substance? What was it in your life that meant that you have to rely on this external source to get those feelings that you're getting from them? That's a harder one for me to answer. That's probably going to take some time, but he phrases that anyway as a birthright, that those feelings you have is a birthright. And the good thing about these questions is they're very compassionate, they're very open, and you're listening to their response and you're not telling them how they're feeling. You're not doing, Melanie Joy talks about this, and I've probably mentioned this a few times, so forgive me if I have, but she talks about compassionate witnessing versus, what's the other one? Hopefully it will come to me as I'm talking about this. Compassionate witnessing is a way of opening up, and it creates connection, and it creates empathy, and you are more empathetic around the people if you're listening to their story, as opposed to defining reality is the second one. If you're defining a reality, if they say, I'm struggling with this, and you say, yeah, I know, or I know what that's like, or I know how that feels, you're cutting off that potential for connection. And these questions are very open questions. They're open. You are here to listen to the answers, and they're non-judgmental either. I'm just trying to think about what happened in my life that made me unable to touch the qualities without. As I say, I was very numb as a teenager. So that was a reaction to obviously something that I still don't understand in myself. But these are very good, useful questions for really thinking about these things anyway. So the first one is, what does it do for you? What does that addiction do for you? What did it do for you in the short term when you would engage in that addictive behavior? And the second one, what happened in your life that made you not be able to touch the qualities, those qualities without that substance? So those are a couple of things. There's plenty of other different help things out there. Just Google, and maybe you can look more specifically or more broadly, but those 12-step ones and that one are good things that you can do right now at this moment, if that's something you wish to do right now. There's no pressure, obviously. You don't feel obliged to, but I think that's the end of my rant. That's the end of my podcast there, my two-parter. I said it might be a two-parter, and actually it's worked out pretty closely that, because it's nearly an hour and a half of stuff I've recorded now. Bloody hell, talking about Football Manager a lot. Just briefly, I just remembered one thing I used to do when I was younger as well, which was similar to my games of, like the ball game I mentioned earlier and the bagging game, but I would write down all the teams in the Premier League, I think in the first 2 leagues or something, and I split them into 6 leagues. And I had a cup as well, and a league cup within that. So I had 3 different things, and I played the whole thing out, again, in terms of promoting and relegating, through dice rolls. I'd roll dice, and I had a book, and it was full of pencil drawings, those things to see who's played who and different scores. It was that did that same job. So I think it's a very primal thing within me. But anyway, enough of that. There's plenty of links in the show notes to check out. A couple of books I might mention that I've already mentioned beforehand. Again, a lot of my information I've got are from a few specific people, like Russell Brand. He wrote that book on recovery, and he's got tons of stuff on his YouTube. Gabor Mate has done endless podcasts. So there's stuff there. In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts is one that I have on audiobook, but it's about 15 or 17 hours long, and I will listen to it, but it's a bit intimidating for me. And Johan Hari, who wrote Chasing the Scream, again about drug policy and about how it affects different people, and I guess it's an argument for legalizing drugs in that way, and also Lost Connections is a great one. Again, check the show notes. There's plenty. I'll have a little look. What have I got? Mae Martin stuff. She did a little BBC show about that. She also did a great TV show called Feel Good, so there's a link to that probably. And BoJack Horseman as well. That's one of my favourite. In fact, that is probably my favourite ever TV show. And that deals with addiction and stuff. I don't know if it's any good, useful in that way, but it's fucking really enjoyable watch. So there's that. A few videos of Rich Roll and stuff, and that Blind Boy thing I mentioned earlier. Yeah, go check them out. Go have a wander and check those things out. Anyway, God, thank you very much for listening to this 2-part. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed making the notes. I've spent all day making the notes, listening to podcasts, looking through books and getting the links, and it's been great fun. So yeah, thanks very much for listening to this. I really appreciate it if you have done the whole thing. God, it means a lot. Genuinely, you haven't even done it yet, but it means a lot. If you could please share this with your friends. God, that would be bloody beautiful, that would. There's a social media, Savage Balance Podcast, and the Twitter is SavBalPod. I want to use it more, but I don't want to use it more because of all of the stuff I just talked about. I'm not going to repeat myself, but I can have difficult, addictive-ish relationships with it, let's just say. There's an email, savbalpod@gmail.com. You know, I wish I could say email me if you're struggling with addiction and I could help you out. I mean, you're more than welcome to, but I am not a expert in any means at all. I'm not really, I wouldn't know necessarily 100% how to help other than all the stuff I've said, but do go and check out that stuff. The different places you can go and have a Google of them, but there's plenty of stuff online. But if you're enjoying this sort of content, or you want more of some other stuff, or you have ideas of things you want, get in touch. I'd so love this to be a community thing. Even if you want to come on and to chat about whatever. If you're an expert in Pebbles, come on and talk to me about Pebbles. I'd love to hear everything interesting about Pebbles, genuinely. So that's savbalpod@gmail.com. There's also a website, savbalpod.com, but I haven't updated it for a long time. I will get to it, I promise. There's still stuff on there, but the longer it goes, the more there is to do, and the less I want to do it. but I will do it. A subscribe, a comment, a rate and review. That'll be lovely. The artwork is by Dolly Gray, and the music is by Danny Tonks. Thank you so much for listening to this. I hope this has helped in some way, and if not, maybe it's inspired you to play Football Manager. I talked about it before, I really want to go and play Pro Evolution now, but instead I'm going to have some soup, I think. So have a good one, guys. Take it easy. And in fact, next week there will be an interview I'm recording that I'm really excited about, and I don't want to say because it's not recorded yet, but I'm really excited about that. So look forward to that. That's going to be a fantastic one once it's down. Take it easy, guys. Look after yourself in the lockdown, and I really respect you, and I think you're a very wonderful person, and you deserve all the love you get. And maybe you deserve even more than that if you're not getting enough. You deserve all the love, basically. I love you very much, and I'll see you next week. Take it easy. Be kind to yourself.